So this lesson here is going to be from my first game from the tournament this past weekend, this U.S. Amateur Team West that I played in. And my opponent was like a tiny little kid. I don't even know how old they were, but they were little. I think she might have been like 10 or 11 or something like that. But she was playing first board for her team, and she was super good. I could not believe that this tiny little kid was good. And like, you know, just by like size, she could have even been like 8, but she seemed poised and mature. So I'm thinking she's like 10 or 11 or something. But yeah, this opponent was quite good for a chibi, and yeah, and I'm picking this because it's going to be a little bit like easier and faster because we only have like half an hour to go over this thing. So, okay. By nature, geez, stop booing me. I just play who I get paired with. You know, it's not like little kids don't try and beat me too. I just, you know, I was very polite. Whatever, you play people. It's not mean to beat somebody in chess. It's not a mean thing. No, she's not titled yet. I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't look up ratings or anything like that, but I don't think she is. Okay. As you guys have probably noticed, by natural temperament, I'm more of an open Sicilian player than like a C3 Sicilian player or a Bishop B5 Sicilian player. But, you know, sometimes the mood strikes me to like sack a bunch of material, like when we were playing Blitz earlier today, and other times my mood is to like explore something new to me. So I've been on and off trying to get better at Ruy Lopez's for a long time, and playing Bishop B5 against the Sicilian is sort of part of that project to get better at the Ruy Lopez. So every now and then I've played in a Blitz game, and this is actually, I think, the first time I've ever played Bishop B5 in a tournament game. I didn't plan it or prepare it, I just played it. Now my opponent plays E6. And the point of the move E6, it seems to me, is to play knight to E7. And then if white ever takes on C6, you recapture with the knight without getting doubled pawns. I think the normal approach to playing Bishop B5 is you kind of like castle, right? And so I imagine castling knight E7. What am I going to do about this? And I didn't see any good move here for white, because basically anytime I trade on C6, that's going to be bad for me because this will come out. But if I don't trade on C6, I'm going to lose all my pressure in the center. So for example, rook to E1, A6, bishop F1, keeping my bishop. Now black can play D5. Well, if I play E5, it's kind of a bad advanced French, right? All of black's moves make sense, right? They haven't wasted any time really. And I don't like the advanced French. If I take on D5, black can take back with the knight. Again, making use of the knight on E7. So, you know, I honestly could not find a good move for white in this position here, right? Where black's playing like the best of the French and Sicilian, and I just don't feel like I have any power in the center to do much. Okay? So, after lengthy thought, like I just couldn't figure out. I was like, once she plays knight E7, I don't know what I'm doing with my stupid bishop on B5. So, I'm just going to try taking on C6. Whoops. Taking on C6. All right. So I did it. And she took back here. And now we get this structure here. And today's lesson is about this doubled pawn. Now, there's all kinds of factors to doubled pawns. The fact that sometimes they can't advance well. The fact that sometimes they can get attacked. The fact that they give you an open file, the fact that this is an extra pawn towards the center. So does it matter if when you're getting doubled pawns, it's an extra center pawn, or if your pawn is getting doubled off towards the H file? There's so many different factors to doubled pawns. And today we are going to learn about one thing about doubled pawns, which is their propensity to block in one of your own bishops. Okay? The fact is, when you have doubled pawns, it can be very difficult to open a related diagonal. Okay? I mean, you've seen a pawn block a bishop before at some point, I'm sure. It's like a theme in chess, right? But when you've got two pawns in a row, it can be very, very, very difficult to move your pawn, right? Even if you have like a pawn to help it next to it, it can be very, very hard to successfully get your pawn out of the way of your bishop. And you've got a whole structure that's liable to block one bishop or another, or sometimes even both. Okay? Okay. So this happens. So one of my first thoughts is to try and block these two c-pawns so they can't move and keep this bishop here bad. But it depends how she plays. For the moment, I just castle. Now, there's a very, very important choice for black to play here between playing d5 or playing d6 and e5. Okay? In the game, she plays d5. But really quick, let's say black plays d6. If they play d6 and e5, this bishop on c8 will be perfectly fine, right? However, what do you think of the bishop on f8? What possible area of the board would that bishop on f8 go to be strong if black plays e5? The answer is it's very hard to find anywhere for that bishop, right? So by putting all the pawns on dark squares, let's say, we've successfully found a way out for this bishop despite the pawn on c6. But we had to put so many pawns on dark squares to let this bishop out that this one has nowhere to go. And in theory, you would want this bishop to be over near like the pawn that's blocking your light squared bishop. But because they're doubled pawns, this bishop would be blocked if it came over to b6. So it seems like, you know, you play this way, you've got one dead bishop, and you play this way, and you've got another dead bishop. And that is like the major struggle with doubled pawns. And normally you'll see this out of the Nimzo Indian opening, but frankly, what I'm playing right here as white, it's basically a Nimzo Indian opening one tempo up. Okay, guys? So this is like completely thematic to what you'll see in the Nimzo Indian, what you're seeing in this particular bishop b5 Sicilian. Very similar thing. So d5 was played, and I played queen t2, knight f6, and d3. All right, and in this position, c4 instead of o to o looks like it forces the issue more. Right here. Okay, so you guys want to talk about c4 here instead of castles kingside. Yeah, this is possible. However, if black goes for d6 and e5, I'm not sure that I want this pawn on c4. Right? Also, if they play d5, we have to check if this is good for white. You have to play d3 because you don't want to trade these pawns, right? The last thing white wants to do is this position. Right now, the black bishops will always be able to get loose. So on d5, you have to be prepared that you're going to play d3. And then you have to be prepared to play with your king in the center. Does this work out for white? It might. I guess this is playable for white. Yeah, you can hold these two squares and keep the black pieces out. But you do have an issue with your king, and you do have a weak d4 square. I wonder if black's... How fast can black get a knight to d4? Not that fast. But they can put a bishop on g7. And maybe idea of playing like bishop d4 and then later e5, right? Get the bishop out and then play the c5, e5 pawn, so let the c8 bishop out. Yeah, you have some chances at a bind. Yeah, you could come here and attack this pawn. And this gets weird, right? This gets pretty weird. It's interesting. There's also the idea of playing bishop a6 here when you can't play b3. Because of your rook. And then the bishop kind of got out, right? I'm not sure that white can hold this bind. I see what you guys want to do. I see what you guys want to do with c4. But, you know, the king is a little bit of like a development issue, kind of slowing us down a little bit. This bishop has fast pressure on this diagonal. I'm not sure how big an advantage we can get out of this for black. Here, bishop d4. I think bishop e3 was good, but you're saying that you want to do this, and they won't be able to challenge this piece. Maybe, but they can play e5, and their bishop has, you know, whole avenues to play on. This just looks like a position to me. They're going to play f6, and I don't know. It looks a little bit playable. I mean, I'm not saying it's like dead equal or anything. I'm not sure of the evaluation, but it might be playable. Bishop e3 probably wins a pawn, but at the cost of messing up our pawn structure. But I think the bigger problem actually is this bishop a6 move from black. I'm not sure how to get a real advantage against that. Okay, so I think that this idea here for white, it makes sense, but I'm not sure whether or not it works. Okay, it heavily depends on whether or not we're able to hold these pawns against, you know, knight f6 and bishop a6 and so on. And this quick black bishop coming to this long diagonal could be a bit of a problem as well. I mean, maybe we should just play king c2 instead of to defend against getting doubled pawns with our king. And now we can play b3 with our king on c2. I'm not saying this completely doesn't work. I'm just saying it's not 100% certain, right? Because now I go for this e5 idea for black, maybe. I don't know. It's out there. It might be a good idea. For the moment, I played castles, which is flexible. It allows me to respond differently to different things that she can do. Like if she goes for quick g6, bishop g7, right, then maybe I play for e5. And if she goes for quick d6, e5, then maybe I play c3, d4 in some position, like exploding the center, because currently I have a development advantage instead of development deficit. So I can... There are situations where I can play differently because I have this other advantage as well with the development. Okay, so I'm keeping it flexible with castles. Your c4 move looks playable. Castles is also probably playable. But in this position, I'd consider knight c3 and d3. e5 might also be playable. Oh, and an important thing to mention about the d6 plan... sorry, this is slightly disorganized on my part, but if we go along too far and I don't say it, I'll never have mentioned it. That if black's going for like the d6 e5 plan, there are definitely some situations where white can play e5 and double isolate these pawns. And now you can eventually win control of e5 for black and force the knight back and play e5 to let your bishop out. But this pawn structure here is always going to reduce the bishop's flexibility somewhat. Like they'll have some open diagonal, but they're kind of be committed. And these pawns become pretty easy to attack when they're doubled isolated and white has a knight blockading on c4. So that's another aspect to keep in mind, that like anytime black goes for d6, e5, white can consider like an e5 option. Anyway, this position here, d3, I'm going to ask you guys a quiz question. After the game, I found a defense for black against my opening. What was it? Okay, have fun with your kids, man. This, as I mentioned the other day, like during this tournament, I got so into the chess thing again that like all night long I was just like thinking of moves and calculating, and I woke up the next morning after this game, after the day I'd played this game, and I had realized that in this position, black had a defense to this opening. Yeah, and you're right about it, Outsmiter. And I know you were also asking whether or not black could play c4 preemptively in some position like this before I even play d3. But what you want to keep in mind, like if we try a preemptive c4, keep in mind that I am this much up in development, right? So I've got other ways to win this position other than keeping these pawns blocked. So yes, you play here. I will have to trade your pawn and open a diagonal for your bishop, right? But I'm going to do it like b3 or something, right? And you're going to get this position. And now my bishop comes to b2. And my rook's on the a file. You just develop my rook. You know what I mean? So, like, white's got a whole other slew of advantages that they could play towards. I'm emphasizing and teaching one lesson about the doubled pawns today, but just solving the doubled pawns is not always going to totally solve the position. And this still looked like a fun position to play for white to me. I think stronger than this option is that this moment here, right after white's played d3, now I think c4 could be the best option. And again, it loses time and it gives white some development lead. But you're going to trade at least for white's center pawn. You're not going to develop their rook for them because they're not going to have this like b3 option. And you're going to crack open a light square diagonal. Now, an interesting thing about this, so we're talking about how these pawns can block in the bishop. An interesting thing is it's not obvious how to play against this bishop when you don't have a light squared bishop. You've got two main options that people use sometimes. One option is you put everything you have on dark squares. So like you put like pawn c3, d4, you know, knight e5. You play around the bishop, and from the dark squares, you attack some light squares, but you just avoid the piece completely. That's one way to play against an opponent's bishop pair. Another way to play is what I did in the game, which is I'm playing for e4, d3, c4. I'm trying to block the bishop with my pawns. So I'm trying to block the bishop physically with my own pawns. The other option, where you blockade all the dark squares, you're trying to control the dark squares, avoid the light squares, and maybe block the opponent's pawns on light squares and have their own pawns block their bishop. Now, is it better to block their bishop with their pawns or your pawns? There's no one answer to that question. So if you see a position like this and you're like, my opponent has an unopposed light squared bishop, I've given him the bishop pair, should I put my pawns on light squares or dark squares? There's not one answer to that question. Similarly, if you're trying to defend this as black, are you just trying to get your pawns to dark squares so your light squared bishop can get out? Or are you just trying to put your pawns to light squares to really crack white's light squares and, you know, be able to like show the power of your bishop and white's weakness on the light squares? Which do you want, right? Again, there's no single answer. But there is one overarching goal that can help you figure out in each position which color squares you want to put your pawns on. And that is, you want to open diagonals on the light squares. Black wants to open diagonals, light square diagonals. So black wants as many as possible of these things to be unobstructed by pawns. Does that make sense? And white wants the opposite, of course. Whatever your opponent wants, you don't want. White wants as many of these diagonals as possible to be closed and blocked. So if your opponent's putting pawns on dark squares as white, then as black, you don't want to put your pawns on light squares and block in your bishop. But if your opponent as white is putting pawns on light squares and you see a chance to force some pawn trades, then you do want to go to light squares and trade. Now, if white could just answer d4, c4 with d4 here, then this would have been, this move here would suddenly become a terrible move. Because now it's just, you know, your bishop's blocked in even more. And now white's going for like, hey, your dark squares are going to be weak, buddy, right? But importantly, in this position, white can't play d4 because they lose e4. So the timing on this move, c4, is actually perfect. White can't play d4 because they lose e4. If they take on c4, you probably play knight takes e4. And this is probably white's best chance, is that now that he's going to lose the fight for the light squares, his best chance is actually going to be to trade all these pawns like you wanted and try and take advantage of his development lead. We'll get to that in a second. And if white takes on d5, you're able to trade on d3, tempoing the queen so you don't lose the pawn on c4. And then after white takes back with pawn or queen, you play this move. Now you'll want to try and castle as fast as possible, and then you'll eventually be able to develop this bishop, and you'll find green pastures for him now. Okay, so real quick, it's not the main part of our lesson, but the best thing that white can do in response to this, I think, is to now try and blow everything open. And that's going to blow open all the light square diagonals, in other words, which I said was black's strategic goal. But at this point, all white has is a development lead No other positional advantage, really. I mean, an isolated A pawn, but that's not going to figure in this game. Not compared to the power of a bishop pair unleashed. So what white has to do now is they have to go for really, really opening the position. And I think d takes c4 might actually be the way to do that. After knight e4, you're going to trade again and then play c4. And you're going to play like knight c3. And you're going to try and like explode this before black gets everything out. I don't think it's going to be good for white. I'll say that. I really don't. Oh yeah, could white play e5 was the other question. Yes, white could play e5, but again, this is also why it's so important. He's got to play it with the queen on e2. If white's queen weren't on e2, the c4 move wouldn't even be good, by the way, guys, because of the answers of white playing like e5 or d takes c4, d takes c, some variations that aren't good for black. But here against e5, again, you trade a pawn, and then move the knight, and your bishop will be able to play in the game. Okay? So this actually is like the solution to this particular opening. Yeah, it just does everything black needs it to do right here, and just barely works in every line. Ensures some pawn trades to eventually open diagonals for the bishop, and then you better scurry and get castled, because you spent a lot of time getting those pawns traded, and that's dangerous to spend a lot of time trading pawns when you're not developed. Now in the game, black missed this one chance to play c4, and they played bishop e7. Now what move did I play? Some of you know my plan here. I now play c4, and that takes away this move c4 from black for good. Or yeah, until I blunder my c pawn somehow, which is hard to do. So now I've blocked this pawn, which blocks this pawn, which blocks this bishop. This bishop's fate is now not looking so good, and I'm going to show you the whole game, even though you don't need to see every detail of every move, and I'm not going to like explain all the tactics on every move, but I'm going to show you the whole game so you can see what role this bishop plays in the game as a whole. Okay, what black's going to fight for now is to try and play like e5 to let the bishop out this way. Okay, and what white's going to fight for is to attack these two dark squares, because if white can attack e5 and c5 and put black on the defensive on those two squares, white can, you know, what black should be weak on ultimately is the dark squares, because he doesn't have the light squared bishop. But what you see me first doing is just blockading the light squares so that his bishop can't be relevant, so that I don't have to worry about defending against counterattacks on the light squares when I start setting up to attack his dark squares, or her dark squares. Okay, so black castles, knight comes out. Bishop to b7 is played. The point of bishop b7, which may look like really stupid, like, hey, that diagonal's never opening. The point of bishop b7 in general is to allow knight to d7 without hanging the pawn on d5. See, knight d7 to play for e5, and white can go takes, 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 takes. You open all the light square diagonals, but you're down a pawn now, right? So that's the point of bishop b7. Let me just promote this. That's the point of bishop b7, is to control d5 and, you know, in some case be able to play knight to d7, both to defend the c pawn or really to play e5. Now, having had to put your bishop on b7 in order to play e5, you guys can perhaps imagine already that a knight on d7, pawn on e5, it's not going to be that easy to actually get the bishop onto the diagonal that you've opened, right? Now that it's on b7, I mean, it's going to take a long time, and you have to not hang your d5 pawn, and you have to get through the knight. So it's not like something that's going to be easy. Okay, b3. This defends c4 in extra time against any counter threats there, but more importantly, this bishop's headed to a3 to start tying black down to that c5 pawn. Here, black played her only really bad move of the game, a6. It's a lost tempo, and I don't know what her idea was with this move. All her other moves, I can tell you what she was up to. But this is a lost tempo and quite a bad move actually. So I continue my plan. Bishop a3. Queen comes here. Knight a4. These pieces are like perfectly secure here, despite the queen kind of eyeing them, and they'll put this pressure on c5. So white's position is pretty good at this point. There doesn't seem to be any prospect for this bishop coming out, and black doesn't control e5 yet, and they're going to start struggling to defend c5, right? Because I could play like queen e3, rook c1. So rook e8 was played. That's the best file to put the rook on, I think. Now I play rook a c1. White's threatening to play cd at some point and then take on c5, right? So I'm trying, by threatening this pawn, to get black to do something with this pawn. If she trades the pawn, right, now I also have the d file to work with, right? And I can attack this pawn with queen e3 at any point, and there won't be d4 as an option anymore. Okay, I can also advance e5 at some point without worrying about leaving a bad pawn behind on d3. And e5 gaining more space, then I can play knight d2, knight to e4, and use that extra space to keep attacking the dark squares. On the other hand, if black plays d4, now I don't have to worry about controlling the d file or defending these pawns, and I can switch to some more kingside operations, maybe with like f4 as an idea. And yeah, I was also considering playing here, forcing the queens off just to make things simpler, and then I want to play f4, knight f3, e5, and again maneuver the knight to e4. Sup, Corn Raid? You know, or I can do the same thing with queens on the board, right? Because I could be like, okay. Yeah, the queen trade, by the way, this, by attacking this, it forces this knight to go defend it, right? And then f4 and knight f3 is the plan, right? So I can force one more piece into passivity defending this by trading the queen. But I was also thinking it might be good to just keep the queens on the board, let this queen be over here, play f4, and, you know, try and fight on the king side maybe, right? With black having two entire pieces that can't really get there. My knight is not very good at getting to the king side either. But, you know, if I play rook c to e1, because now this is pointless. If I play rook c to e1 and go for like a king side attack with f4, this bishop can always switch back very easily. But this queen and bishop would take longer to get over there. So more than one plan there. That's what I'm going for. She understood that and excellently tried to avoid resolving this tension and plays rook c8, defending the c pawn indirectly. Anytime I play cd, she has cd. So that was a good move. Showing that she understood what I was up to. And here again, I'd been thinking of queen d2 to trade queens, or queen e3 to try and force black to play d4. And then I found an even better move, knight e5. It's a unique opportunity. The idea of this move is to prevent black from playing knight to d7. So I'm taking away one of the potential defenders of c5, which means my threat here on black just playing do is to play queen e1, right? Rook takes, and now black can't play knight d7. So the pawn on c5 basically just dies. So that's knight e5, cutting off black's defense with knight d7. And black's basically faced with just losing this pawn straight away now. So the game went into some tactics from here. Bishop d6. Yeah, you could try like f4 with a complicated positional game that continues, but my plan was knight f7, so I played it. I'd calculated that this was good. I didn't look at f4 very deeply because I knew this was good, and I looked at it first. So yeah, so knight f7. If king f7, the point is just e5 and then trading. All I'm doing is I'm trading off one of the pieces that could have defended c5 for my knight on f3, right? Like if you look at this position here. The main point is that my knight on f3 just traded for the piece that could have come to d7. So c5 is just not really defensible now. And you could win c5 immediately with queen e1. Right? And just go here, and black can't stop bishop c5. So that's really my whole idea behind this move, knight f7. It looks flashy, but all I'm doing with knight e5, knight f7, sorry, let me promote this variation. All I'm doing with knight e5 and knight f7 is I'm trading the f3 knight, the one piece that I couldn't get to c5. I'm trading it for one of these two pieces, which are the two minor pieces that can defend c5. So I'm trading off stuff so that I get left with this bishop against one of these pieces, right? And me winning c5. So she played a tactical move here, bishop f4. She had seen knight f7 coming and calculated that she would have this answer. So for those of you who heard my early comment about I was surprised how good this little kid was, yeah, when she was thinking about it before playing bishop d6, she saw knight f7. She saw that it would be bad for her, except she thought she had this bishop f4 move. And the point of this bishop f4 move is basically to trap the knight on f7 and take it without allowing e5. Unfortunately, white has one really strong move here, which is like a super simple move, but like it's exactly an example of like that like Imagination in Chess by Pata Gaprindashvili. It's exactly the kind of super simple move that a lot of people won't see. But super props to MC Joshua for being able to see this. It's just that you go straight back to d6. Yeah, you just go to the square that was previously occupied by the bishop. Just hang the knight in thin air. But because you attack two rooks, you know, black will end up down a pawn if they take on c1 and you take back, and then next move take a rook. Plus they'll eventually lose c5 as well. So knight d6, bishop d6, and I finally get my fancy trade, right? Yes. It's like one of the fanciest trades ever made, right? So many weird tactics just to like trade a piece, you know? But you can see that c5 is very difficult for black to defend now, and this bishop's not useful. In fact, I could have just played queen e1 here to win this pawn. But I was a little bit afraid that, you know, in this kind of position, I have given black sort of like a pawn mass in the center, right? There's still some work to be done to win this endgame because I've given black this, I've given up my e pawn for the g pawn. It makes me hard to control the dark squares in the center. And black will play e5 and defend this endgame down a pawn. Now, maybe I can still win it, but I can't stop e5 and I can't stop bishop f5 at some point. So it's definitely still a game, you know? Maybe there's a plan with b4, rook c3, a3. I don't know exactly, but this is not the clearest. There's easier ways to win this position. So I will go queen g4 instead of collecting my pawn right away. Queen g4, king here, rook here. So basically, I'm going to continue playing against these bishops for a little while longer. Try and keep fighting against this pawn structure to try and see if I can block in these bishops. Yeah, so rook e1. Bishop develops, and rook e3. The threat is to eventually attack this king. The rook can't switch over as long as I keep queens on the board because of queen e6. Right? So this is really the reason not to go for quick queen e1, is that my queen is so much better than black's queen. I can use my queen to make threats over here, make black like try and bring their queen around somewhere to like try and like counter me, and then I can always take on c5. No reason to, you know, go out of my way to trade black's worst piece. I mean, honestly, this queen's like as bad as the bishop pretty much. Well, no, not quite, but second worst piece. So, yeah, so this is easier technique. So rook e3, the queen tries to get in. Rook c to e1. So if queen takes a2, both rook e6 and bishop c5 win. Black's king position gets cracked open and they get mated, right? So, you know, b takes c6 was fine, but it had a drawback, right? The drawback is that you have to deal with the problem of these doubled pawns, and here, as the course of this particular game went, black has not solved that problem, and white has managed to leave that as a problem for black forever. So I'm just transferring towards kingside attacking. The queen can't seem to get back. d4 to try and get her back. I think I played bishop c1. I just think. Yes, I played bishop c1. So because if I lift the rook, the queen can come here, and then she helps defend a little bit, like rook e6, queen g6. You see, I mean, I still win this pawn, but this is not what I wanted, right? For that queen to get back into the mix. So I played bishop c1. If the queen comes to c2, my rook can come to h3 because there's no longer queen e1 mate. So the queen went to b4. It's also stopping me from playing rook e6 because of queen e1. For anybody wondering why I'm not taking on e6. But now that I chase the queen back over here off of my d pawn, I can just lift my rook here. And there's just not really any moves for black here. Played f5, check, here, check, here. Bishop d2. Now I get the queen off of my rook. Remember what I said way early on about how the bishop on a3 that was tying black to c5 could always come around and swing around if it wanted to join a kingside attack? That has now happened. The black queen is now basically like completely trapped off here uselessly, and rook h4. Not really defendable. Okay, and black resigned. And look at the position of these two pieces, you know, after another 15 moves. The reason I play through the whole game for you is just so that you can see how one thing can lead to another thing, and what the shape of like a whole game might be. Right? What was the cost of this bishop on b7, right? What was the cost of this pawn on c5 that black had to defend? Right? There were variations where I could have won the pawn, but this is another very effective way of exploiting what I did over on the queen side, right? So yeah. Stop trying to make me feel like a bully just for like playing this game and showing it to you guys. I'm trying to teach you something despite the fact that I have to show you a game where I beat a little kid. I take no like joy in beating somebody. Just joy in chess, you know, the logic and what we can learn and understand here is really cool. So please stop making me feel bad. I'm very susceptible to it. It's very cruel of you guys to attack me in such a effective way. I do not like being the bad guy. Anyway, you guys see the two pieces from start to end. This is one of the major things that can be a problem with doubled pawns, is that it can be very hard to activate one or even both bishops when you've got doubled pawns. All right. And that's it for today. Any questions about that? / more jokes about me beating a little girl. I didn't take her candy. I didn't offer her candy either. I just played the game, asked if she wanted to analyze like any other serious chess player who played a good game. She only made one real mistake, right? Which was a6 was a bad